Welcome to GenPAC's 8x8 series, in which we go into detail and discuss the 8 national priorities published by FinCEN in 2021 to combat money laundering and terror financing. Today's discussion will be focused on priority of proliferation finance. Welcome. I'd like to introduce Mo Rusin. Mo is a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, or also as it's known, MIS. There, she's the director of financial crime management programs. She's been teaching financial crime-related courses for more than 25 years and has launched the career of many people in our industry. Those people are affectionately known as the MIS AML Mafia. Another thing that Middlebury Institute is well known for is its study of WMD proliferation studies, particularly with respect to North Korea. So it's great for us, and it's no surprise that Mo is going to talk much about proliferation finance, particularly how it involves North Korea and Iran, and then maybe some larger global issues that are going on right now. So we're happy to have her here to talk about one of the 8 national AML CFT priorities that FinCEN released last year. Okay, so why don't we dive into it? For financial crime professionals, proliferation finance isn't typically something that's spoken a lot about in the day-to-day of work, if you're cash activity and structuring and narcotics trafficking. But obviously, the issue is very significant. So could you just give us a brief background on what is proliferation finance and why do you think it's made its way into the 8 national priorities?
Right. Well, okay. Well, as for the 8 national priorities, I think they include everything but the kitchen sink, right? So, all of the usual suspects when it comes to, predicate offenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the reason why we often treat proliferation financing separately, like terrorism financing, from other types of money laundering, because technically, terrorism financing and proliferation financing are both money laundering, where the predicate offense, happens at the end as opposed to the beginning, right? We treat it separately, well, partly for that reason. Okay, so if we think about the traditional 3 stages of money laundering: placement, layering, and integration. In the case of terrorism financing and proliferation financing, it's not placement, it's fundraising.
Okay.
Right? And then you have the layering, of course. That's what all of them have in common, is the layering. That's the exciting, interesting part of it all. And then at the end, in the case, in terrorism financing, you're funding a terrorist organization or, God forbid, some kind of terrorist act. In the case of proliferation financing, it's all about procurement of dual use goods, goods that can be used in the furtherance of, say, a nuclear proliferation program. Now, there is the technical definition of proliferation financing that FATF adheres to in their recommendation 7, and that is very strict and narrowly defined. But in practice, in our field and of anti-money laundering, and for the purposes of compliance, for our audience here, we think of it more broadly. We're not talking about nuclear proliferation necessarily. We're talking about WMD proliferation. So nuclear, biological, radiological, and dual use goods too. That's really tricky as well. I mean, I can talk more about.
Yeah. So explain a little bit about again, and I think in the more commonplace AML CFT departments, we're focusing in on mostly well understood crimes, fraud, narcotics trafficking. But then in proliferation finance, you have this it's sort of a little bit different, because it isn't necessarily someone trafficking in an illegal good.
Mhm.
it's a legal good, but it could be
Could
used for
be.
purposes
Right.
that the U.S. government and other Western governments don't want it to be used for. So could you talk just a
Mhm.
little bit about what dual use means and
Yeah.
the role the Department of Commerce plays in that?
Right. Right. Yeah. BIS, Department of
Hmm.
Commerce. Right.
Maybe talk a little bit about dual use, but then I'll ask
Yeah.
another question is the role of these either individuals or organizations
Mhm.
that do the procurement. So it
Right.
isn't North Korea or Iran directly
Mhm.
trying to procure,
Mhm.
though maybe they are, but that
Right.
isn't the only thing they should be looking for. You need to be looking for these sort of middlemen or middle organizations that are
Mhm.
in between.
Right. Yeah. And it's so difficult. So going back to your question about dual use goods, there are so many technological components that are necessary for, uranium enrichment and other elements of a nuclear program. And a lot of these, well, almost all of these technological components have an alternative legitimate use, like pressure transducers. Before I got into this field, I didn't even know what pressure transducers are. And most people in the financial services sector don't know what pressure transducers are either. And,
I'll count myself among those
right,
people.
right. Can we expect them to know that? I mean, the largest financial institutions with the largest sanctions compliance programs do actually have at least one person on staff who does understand that. But then again, that assumes that you have access to that kind of detailed knowledge about the trade transaction, for example. So maybe your trade financing department might have some insight into what exactly is being traded, but they also might change the codes so that the codes make it seem as if it's some kind of technology that doesn't
Mhm.
make the list of dual use goods that are considered high risk. It's very, very complicated. And so what we need to do is look for other types of red flag indicators, often behavioral indicators. Don't necessarily put yourself in the situation of looking for proliferation financing. What you're looking for is suspicious activity. And then you leave it to law enforcement, you leave it to the intelligence community to take that SAR that you wrote up and then, follow, connect the dots, let them connect the dots to tie it to proliferation financing.
Right, because
What our
it
job
doesn't.
is as compliance professionals is to create the actionable intelligence that they can then carry forward in their investigations.
Right. So that's an important point is we talk about different complicated electronic components. And
Mhm.
it's unlikely that anyone in a financial institution is going to
Yeah.
either understand that or even have access to the underlying information
Mhm.
involved in a transaction. But yeah, if you see this strange route of transactions to different jurisdictions around the world, to your point, if that's reported in a SAR and you explain that, that's what
Mhm.
the suspicion was, then right, it would be up to law enforcement to then actually be able to figure out, was there a violation? Was there dual use issues here? So
Right.
that, yeah,
Yeah.
that's an
Yeah, and
important point.
it's what it boils down to. It's part of sanctions compliance,
Yeah.
essentially, right? It should be part of any sanctions compliance program. We shouldn't simply rely on the OFAC SDN list as our checklist.
Okay.
The best compliance programs will also look through the UN panel of experts reports, where they list a lot of other front companies that, for whatever reason, haven't made it to all of these different sanctions lists yet.
Okay. Just to speak a little bit about what tangentially what's going on in the world right now with Russia and Ukraine and sanctions. And while many countries are participating in the sanctions, many countries are not. there may be fewer transactions occurring in dollars, at least presently and maybe going forward. What do you, just to hypothesize a little bit, how do you see that impacting the ability to identify and track proliferation finance, if at all?
Yeah. Yeah, very good question. So I am not as concerned that the dollar is going to lose its primacy as the world's key reserve currency
Mhm.
in the next decade, maybe even next 2 decades. But I don't like to think beyond 1 decade. But and there's a reason for that. Okay. When you look at the composition of the world's global foreign exchange reserves, which is how countries trade, okay, they need their foreign exchange reserves to conduct trade. US dollars comprise more than half of those foreign exchange reserves. And when you throw in the British pound, the Japanese yen, and the euro into that, it's the vast majority of foreign exchange reserves. And the EU or the Eurozone and the UK and Japan are all with us when it comes to not just UN Security Council resolutions related to sanctions, but even Russian related sanctions today. They're with us. The Chinese are not. They are not implementing sanctions compliance
Right.
the way we would like them to, right? And they're violating it, left and right. And I like to say that the people who are really benefiting from, this whole Russia-Ukraine conflict are the Chinese.
Mhm.
They now have access to cheap Russian oil, and now
Yeah.
India as well. So the Chinese renminbi is not yet freely convertible. And as long as that's the case, the US dollar is going to be the supreme reserve currency
Okay.
in the world.
Well, that's good for a whole host of reasons. One, of course, one of which is the ability to hopefully, track proliferation finance and, have a view into it as it comes through the Western financial system.
There's another layer to this as well. And that is, I think what the future holds is, especially now that so many people have been burned with crypto, a lot of that excitement has eroded a little bit. But there are a lot of innovations that came out of this whole crypto era, including the blockchain, for example. I think the applications are very interesting. But digital central bank currencies, that's where we're headed next. And the US is unfortunately behind the curve on that, I think, because our financial services sector was very reluctant to let that happen. And they have a lot of influence in Washington, D.C. But now that the rest of the world is moving in that direction, we are now finally talking about it. And I think that's the direction that the world is going, that everyone is going to have central bank digital currencies, and they're trying to figure out how to create an equivalent SWIFT system that allows for, cross-border transactions with those central bank digital currencies.
And I know we're in the early stages of central bank digital currencies, but
not really.
Well, good
There
point.
are, I think, 10 countries that have already fully rolled out their CBDCs, and then another 30 that are in a pilot program.
Yeah. Is one of the suppositions accurate, though, when people say that they'll be easier to track and trace? Like it will be easier to watch a flow of funds go around the world. Okay.
Yes, yes. And that's exciting. It's exciting for those of us who are in the compliance space and criminal investigation space. Absolutely.
Yeah. Might not be as exciting for those in the privacy space.
Right.
So one more thing I'd like to touch on before we begin to wrap up. And where do you, just briefly, where do you see any changes, significant changes in the next 2 or 3 years regarding proliferation finance, either how the financing is perpetrated, or conversely, how any new regulatory or government actions that you foresee in the next couple of years?
Yeah, well, I do, some people, roll their eyes when it comes to FATF and the mutual evaluation process, but I am a big believer in it. I respect that process, as well as the role of naming and shaming with the FATF gray list. So now that we've largely completed this 4th round of mutual evaluations, we've seen that there are still quite a few countries that are only partially compliant with recommendation 7, the proliferation financing recommendation. And they are under pressure to fix that. And sometimes it's just, the freeze without delay, that's the without delay piece that they haven't quite fixed yet.
Right.
Or it's something else, and in terms of who besides just the banks. What about fintech companies and money service businesses? Are they even aware of proliferation or counter-proliferation financing and sanctions compliance? So those sorts of things. And when the UAE was put on the FATF gray list, that made everyone take notice.
Okay.
A lot of people didn't think that would ever happen. A lot of people didn't think Pakistan would ever be put on the FATF gray list because they had enough allies in FATF to keep them off of it for a while. But then they were put on and are still on. But when the UAE got put on there, a lot of people thought, oh my gosh, that was a shocker. And they thought, oh, I guess, that could be us.
Yeah, there's right.
And nobody wants that to happen. And so I really do think that countries are going to take it more seriously, and not just fixing their laws and regulations, but also demonstrating enforcement. They can't just pay lip service to it.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much for taking the time today. This was an interesting discussion on a interesting and very consequential topic. So thank you again very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
We're going to turn now to our experts from Genpact and hear some of their insights and perspective on proliferation finance. Today, we're going to hear from Joe Gillespie, Morgan Parker, and Ryan Skousen. Just to tee this up, this is one of those topics that for many people who read the 8 national priorities, for those who work in the AML and sanctions space and financial institutions, this one was a little curious because it isn't a topic that financial institutions necessarily deal with every day. But what's interesting between Joe, Ryan, and Morgan is in their prior life, doing a lot of work with the government around threat finance, these issues, data analytics. This is going to be an interesting discussion. So Joe, let me just hand it to you a little bit, maybe a little bit more on a background if you want, and then we can just segue into how you see that prior work that you guys have done dovetailing with the issue that financial institutions have to consider.
Yeah, thanks, David. Really appreciate it. Excited to be talking about this today. As you say, I don't think it gets a lot of airtime, and maybe for good reason. I think that it's obviously a significant issue and poses a significant threat to the general public, and so governments around the world take it very seriously. As with the whole sort of compliance regime and anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing more generally, financial institutions are at that pointy end of the spear, right? They have an obligation to if they see something, they say something, and there's lots of regulation and instruction, international standards about what they should be looking for, red flag indicators, and so this one's no different in my mind. I think governments, just from our work, over the last many years, they have a different advantage. They're able to see information reported from lots of financial institutions, and they have the ability to mingle together sources and build out like a network, right? A threat network, and see who's trying to do what. They know who bad actors have been in the past based on, other sources of information that they have. And so they're able to monitor in a different way. Any given financial institution, we talk about this often, if this is a battle space, right? If this is a war that's raging, they're able to see just, they're looking at the battle space through like a straw, right? They're only able to see a tiny little aperture, or through a tiny aperture. But there are things that they should look for. They should be vigilant. And I think the AMLA, it's right that it's calling it out, right? It shouldn't be forgotten. But I think it's important that institutions not try to do too much, right? There's a lot that you can do. There are great analytics out there, but if you apply it without the requisite data, I mean, you're just not going to get anything back, right? Garbage in, garbage out. But I think it's a really important topic. So thanks for bringing us together today, David.
Yeah. Ryan, if I could sort of get your perspective on this issue, when you think about, the topic of money flowing to state or non-state actors to build biological, chemical, or, God forbid, nuclear weapons, and you think about your expertise as a CTO, as a technologist, as a developer, engineer, and then you marry that with your AML expertise. What are some of the things that come to mind?
Well, segueing off of what Joe just said, I think through that tiny aperture, right, as you're looking at that battlefield, the danger of doing too much, of getting too involved, is noise, right? In the technology world, I mean, generally in AML, we're always battling, right? Accuracy, precision against noise. And for the government, on the government side, their perspective is, when we can do something, when we're looking at something, they want to hear and know about it. But if we're just doing too much, if we're pushing too much out, what that ends up being is a lot of reporting on noise without context. And that muddies the space. It muddies the analysis on the side of the government that's trying to then action and do something about these activities. So that said, I think when you talk about that money movement, it's, you're looking at very specific things, cross-border money movement. You're looking at, especially starting to look at things like what kind of, where is the geography? What is the risk of the geography that money's coming in from? And having a little bit of discretion around reporting when I'm talking about, money between two very low risk geographies versus a high risk geography.
Talk a little bit about data is obviously critical in all aspects of investigation and analysis, but maybe even, maybe more so in this case. What are the types of data that you think would be useful to help an investigator, compliance officer, ferret out whether or not this actually is potentially something to do with proliferation financing?
I think first I would frame up and say it's important to know what an institution should be looking for. What does this look like? So, I mean, on the one hand, and we've talked about this before, but like you could be looking for, dual use technologies, things that are sort of on the fringe that could be used to manufacture or, create some of these WMD type material or the weaponization of them. But that is far more complex, right? Like if you're involved in a trade finance deal and someone's handing you a bill of lading and it shows that you're getting certain precursor materials, okay, but like, is that really what we're talking about? Is that really what you should be looking for? I think the answer is more no. I think what you should be looking for, or what we expect this typology to be like, based on what we've seen over the years, is more like the money flow, right? International money flow. So it's more about correspondent banking. So it's like, what are the controls if you're participating, if you're facilitating the flow of money internationally, that the correspondent banking relationships that you have, what are the controls you have in place there? And so the customer's customer, right? The the transactions that you're helping to facilitate through the distant end bank, what do you know, and what risk is pooling there? That leads to in an interesting direction. When you then say, what data do we have? What data could we use? What data do we not have? And maybe we could leverage.
I think it's all about using data in new ways to kind of perform analyses in the aggregate. Whereas we're very good at doing analyses on transactions and transactions on people, or analyses on people. What we have to do now is think about doing analyses on our correspondent banks, these entities and their entities one step out, so that we understand the risk of what they do in their KYC processes and their CDD processes. And if we understand that, we can understand the risk around that correspondent bank and have a proxy risk metric built up so that we're able to understand if there could be potential problems there.
Yeah, a lot of the questions I've been asking are focused much around that investigator or that due diligence analyst who's doing that work. But sticking with the fact that most of what we do in this field just gets back to fundamentals. So there's real risk assessment that takes place here too. It's part of that correspondent banking, risk assessment process. This is just something else to consider.
Completely agree, Dave. And I think there's the initial risk assessment, which I think is well established. And this is maybe a dimension, right? Like in that initial risk assessment. But this really gets to what Morgan was describing, especially the way he phrased it. It gets to like, how do you do ongoing sort of dynamic risk assessment as you're seeing the stream of transactions flow? How do you do a dynamic, continuous risk assessment against that correspondent bank that you perform periodic due diligence on and periodic, risk assessment on? But then how do you keep it going? And then how do you look at your portfolio in the aggregate? It's a really interesting concept, and the data exists, and there are ways to do it if you systematize it. If it's just a pure risk assessment where it's manual and you send some people in and they take a check, it is what it is. But how do you continuously monitor that? It's an interesting thing to do, and it helps attack on this vein.
Yeah, using kind of some of our technologies, we can do that so that we can have thresholds and filter points that allow someone to go in and take a deeper dive investigation when there are risky activities occurring. Right. If we're just doing kind of periodic reinvestigations and we take people and we put them on a team because a year has passed or 5 years have passed from their last investigation point, we're missing maybe a lot of context in the middle and potentially a lot of risk that occurred in the middle. There might even be a spike point, and it might be lowered, based on an enforcement action or something like that after the fact. So we might actually obfuscate the risk there.
In the Joe, you mentioned earlier the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, and in there are provisions where hopefully there'll be some more meaningful steps taken where the government and private sector can share information. I know from the industry perspective, that's something we've all wanted for years. This sounds like a topic that would benefit tremendously from the government sharing information, with the industry, with people building software, because I think this sounds like one of those topics where the government just probably knows a whole lot more about what's going on than those of us, doing the work day to day.
Yeah, and it's an interesting dynamic, right? Because there are certain things that the government just can't share, right? There are things that would reveal, sources and methods, and there are things that they know that, they don't want. You certainly don't want to proliferate knowledge and have more threat actors crop up. You don't want threat actors that you're monitoring to know that you're monitoring them. So it gets complex, but at the same time, it's important that those who can help you, that act as sensors, right? Sources of intelligence information, that they know what you want them to be looking for. And I think that's the line that you're seeing is, it's a difficult line to walk.
Yeah. Ryan or Morgan, as the sort of engineers on the call, if you were asked, look, you have all the resources you need to figure out a way to detect this particular problem. And I know this is put you on the spot, but is there anything sort of available with software technology or data at the moment that could somehow make identifying things in the mass of correspondent banking transactions, could something that could just make it a little bit easier? Or is this just a battle we're going to just keep fighting day in, day out?
Yeah, I think it all starts with data and understanding the data that you have and the data that you may be able to have access to. Because we can always take data and kind of disregard it. But if we don't have data, if we haven't gone and gotten that data and then cleaned up that data in a way that makes that data meaningful, I think as Joe alluded to, garbage in, garbage out earlier on the call, if we haven't cleaned up that data to understand it and make sure that we have data out of just random data points, and we have knowledge out of that data, that's where it starts. So doing some good data engineering, understanding your ability to get kind of third-party and open source records from different providers, and gleaning that data together to give you a picture of either your individual's risk of the entities that your customers, or your customers' customers in terms of correspondent banking. That's where it all starts, right? That's where we build our pyramid. So as we grow, we can build on top of technologies and analytics and all kinds of filtering technologies for alerting. But if we don't start on a good basis of data, all of that stuff is moot as we build that up. So start with data, grow your data, and be able to filter and kind of interact with and clean your data really well. There are lots of tools out there. Risk Canvas is one of them that kind of put data first as a first order priority in our system, to be able to kind of clean and enhance data.
So Joe, as we wrap up here, do you have any, if you back to sort of that AML professional who's at their desk, they're looking at something they might not understand, is there any sort of just practical takeaways that you would suggest?
Yeah, I mean, there are the obvious ones, right? Like if and it depends on the type of instrument that's being used, but the obvious ones around trade finance, right? Like if it is a trade finance deal and you don't know the actors involved, or you're considering supporting the issuance of something, and it seems like they might be there might be controlled components, like weapons related components, you should use extra care and make sure you perform the appropriate diligence on both sides of that equation. Those are obvious. Those are certainly things that are required and mandatory. But beyond that, it's about, there's an education component here for sure. Be aware of what threat actors are attempting to do, so that when you're conducting an investigation, you have, let's assume you have all the right controls in place and things are alerting appropriately. You can investigate through the correct lens. I think we've seen that a lot, where if you don't understand the trade craft that the enemy is attempting to employ, even if you have all the right controls in place, when a human comes and looks at it, if they don't understand what the bad guy's trying to do, it's tough to say whether this thing is suspicious or not. So it is very important to understand what this would look like, what threat actors are attempting to do. But ultimately, it's more more just do your job and understand, and then trust that the rest of the system is working as it should.
Okay, well, that's great. This was a good discussion around one of those topics that isn't often discussed in our field. A lot of challenges in this, but I think we did a good overview of some of the ways to combat the issue. And I thank everybody for their time. Okay, so far we've learned about the risk of proliferation finance and how those who want to engage in fund proliferation finance do that. So now let's turn to a conversation with Quinn Hout of Risk Canvas. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a couple of scenarios. We hope they're very practical actions people can take away in which you should be monitoring and detecting potential proliferation finance and the steps that you can take to investigate it and if necessary, report it. So Quinn, why don't I ask you to tell everybody what we're looking at here, and then we can walk through a couple of scenarios.
Yeah, so we're looking at our scenario workbench here, and this is just an interface where we can build scenarios. And as you know, we've talked about, when we talk about proliferation financing, one of the biggest risk areas is around correspondent banking. So I've filtered down to just a couple of scenarios here that we have around correspondent banking. And just so that we can kind of give a flavor of the types of detection scenarios that you would put in place as controls if you have this type of offering. And so the first one I have teed up here is correspondent banking, large round dollar transactions. So this is looking at most large transactions that have a business purpose. Are not going to, end with, rounded to $100. Statistically, most of the time there's more of an odd ending. And so there's something suspicious oftentimes when there is that round dollar amount. And so basically what we're looking at here really simply is we're looking at transactions that are over $100,000, which are rounded to, the $100 space. So we're looking at, transactions that end with this ending, and we're looking at transactions that are over $100,000. This is going to flag and create alerts for correspondent banking account types that meet that criteria. We'll look at, how those are investigated here in a minute. But maybe a couple other examples to share. Another one here is around large transactions involving a high-risk jurisdiction. And so oftentimes what's interesting from an AML standpoint for proliferation financing is when either the originator or the beneficiary is in a secrecy haven or some kind of high-risk jurisdiction. Obviously, North Korea or Iran, or those are obvious, and those would be caught as part of sanctions anyways. But other jurisdictions that are also commonly used as havens, like the Seychelles, for example, that you want to look at those large transactions that are flowing through there. And so again, transactions are over $100,000 where either the beneficiary or originator are located in one of those high-risk jurisdictions. Now, most institutions that we work with manage a list. They manage a list of high-risk jurisdictions, and that would include secrecy havens. It would include drug trafficking zones, a variety of things that go into building that high-risk jurisdiction list. But in this situation, what we're looking at is transactions that are greater than $100,000. And then basically, if the beneficiary country is, located on the high-risk jurisdiction list, if any of that is contained on the list, we would then flag it. Or if the originator country is on that high-risk country jurisdiction list, that would also be something that we would want to create an alert off of. So those are just some very simple examples. Obviously, any of these examples you can kind of stratify by the customer risk level. So, if it's a high risk customer, maybe you drop that threshold. And not all high risk jurisdictions are created equally as well. So you can also stratify based on, the risk score of that country. Maybe if it's high, you could have a lower threshold. So there's more precision that you can get by kind of building variations of these types of scenarios. And then just the one other one that I'll mention is around unusual behavior. Obviously, this is kind of a catch-all for a lot of AML type of activity, but this is looking at amounts or value of transactions for a specific correspondent banking account that are anomalous. So we look at building kind of a baseline of, how many transactions per week or per month is normal for this account. And then when we see, dramatic increases in the number of transactions, that's something that we want to take a closer look at. Or if we see, most transactions are around $100,000 or $200,000, and then all of a sudden we have, a $1 million transaction, that is anomalous. And so we want to take a look at that transaction. So these are just some examples. Obviously, there's more that we could show, but this will give you a flavor of the type of activity that we're looking for. Then the other thing we want to talk a little bit about is, just kind of in practice, what do you look for as an investigator? So once that alert has fired, what are the types of indicators that you might look for as you conduct an investigation? So as we come in here into our case management tool, we can see here that we have an alert that's fired for that first scenario that we talked about, the large round dollar transaction scenario. So we're looking at transactions that are over $100,000 that are round dollar amounts. Here you see that this is the transaction that kind of fired the alert on this account. There's a transaction for $662,800. So it's a rounded number. You can see the origin bank is in London. The originator bank is in London. The beneficiary is in Toronto, and it's a wire transaction from originator E to beneficiary I. And this is just kind of dummy demo data here. But you can see that transaction. Now, typically, as you conduct an investigation here, one of the first things you're going to want to do is kind of look at the transaction behavior. And you're going to want to look at specifically the transactions that perhaps are happening between, beneficiary I, and who is their originator? It was E. Is that right? E. Yeah. Okay. So then we'll look at originator E. And so here we see there are 4 transactions. One of them is the one that we already created the alert for. But let's go ahead and just pull these in just so that we can include them as part of our investigation. So now we can look at, all 4 of those transactions that have happened between these parties. A couple things that are noteworthy. Obviously, the amounts of these other transactions are not round dollar. So perhaps this round dollar one is just a coincidence. But something that maybe is a little bit interesting is that the locations of both the origin banks and the beneficiaries are different each time. So that might be something that we want to look a little bit deeper into. And a lot of times when we're doing these investigations for correspondent banking type of alerts, what really matters is kind of doing some due diligence on the originators and the beneficiaries for that correspondent. Unfortunately, you may not always have that CDD data for the originator and or the beneficiary in the transaction. So sometimes that'll come down to kind of conducting some due diligence and aggregating data externally from paid data sources. Oftentimes it also may involve sending an RFI, for example, to a branch manager or to the institution, and asking them to provide due diligence files for a specific originator or beneficiary, along with oftentimes you want to ask for a explanation of the business purpose of the transaction, especially for these large dollar transactions. So once you've kind of done that investigation, you've collected the data, assuming that, let's pretend for a second that you see something suspicious and you want to escalate this, you'll move this alert to a case, and then you may do more of a due diligence investigation, but eventually that'll kind of culminate in filing of a SAR. So in our environment here, you can actually file the SAR electronically. A lot of the data here is going to be automatically pre-filled for you. But we did want to spend a minute, and maybe I'll pass it over to you, Dave, just to give myself a break here. What are the types of things that you would do when you're filing a SAR for Proliferation Finance? What are the things that you might tag here as part of the SAR filing?
Well, I think there's a couple of options under money laundering. It could be if, for example, you send the RFI out, the RFI comes back, and actually the bank officer is saying, we don't actually know who this originator is, and so in that case, you might be concerned about the source of funds. And the other scenario you talked about, the third one, Quinn, is something out of the ordinary. So that could be transaction out of pattern for the customer. So I think that those are two things. And then, of course, in the second column there, the suspicious designation, the beneficiaries, that could come down again to the types of due diligence information that you're going to get. And then, if generally speaking, the suspicious EFT and wire transfer is a catch-all, not as specific necessarily as the others, but certainly acceptable in this case. And then I think in the narrative of the SAR, the part 5, it's very important. Obviously, proliferation finance isn't something that I think we learned in our discussion so far today, isn't something that necessarily happens all of the time, something like a structuring or wires to high-risk countries, but it clearly is a national priority. So it's really important that in this narrative, you call out right away that this, we're filing the suspicious activity report because of suspicion of proliferation. That you have to get the attention of FinCEN or law enforcement readers. So that's critical. And like all SAR narratives, make sure you just answer the who, what, why, where, when, and how in this case. But again, really highlight that it has to do with proliferation finance. Like I said, I think those are more atypical SARs. So we want the readers of that to know the seriousness of the SAR.
We talked about this a little bit in our episode about terrorist financing. I think it applies here as well, where if you're filing this type of SAR, you should probably also follow up with law enforcement counterparts and follow up on that SAR as well, because those are significant. And unfortunately, oftentimes you won't know, right? You'll see what we saw here, where there were some transactions with a round dollar that didn't really make sense, or you don't know what the business purpose is, or you do due diligence on beneficiary I, and that it looks a little questionable, like they look like they could be a shell company, and their business, they don't have a website, or their website is sketchy. You don't know enough to say, hey, that's proliferation financing, right? So the best you can do in that situation is just going to be, to tag the right vague, checkbox here. And that's unfortunate, but certainly if you do see something that is clearly related to proliferation, you want to.
I would agree, Quinn. I think the most likely tip you would get would be probably an adverse media. We want to thank you for joining our discussion today on proliferation finance. And as always, if you want to learn more about this topic or have discussions, please reach out to the folks at Genpact, either Joe Gillespie, Brian Skousen, or Morgan Parker. Thank you.